Okay, hi everyone. Nice to see you, Jamieson, and I'm so glad to be with you and with all of you who we can't see in the audience. Hi from Western Massachusetts. So, Jameson, this preparing for this event was my third time reading this book, and it was a pleasure to return to it. It's a book that has very much its own rhythm and bears rereading. And so, I think about your book often in this kind of ongoing COVID pandemic. And this week, I think most recently, it came into mind because I was listening to a presentation by the political economist Melinda Cooper, which is like a quite a straightforward account of the asset economy and the far right. But she made this kind of incredible observation midway that Donald Trump is very often depicted by his followers as a balloon. And she comments on the relation between this quality of air, of being kind of filled up with air, and the question of what it means to try to control all of those things that expand and circulate and grow, and the relation between that image of the balloon and the kind of terminal absurdity of many of the crises that we face now around the question of the commons and these failures that you deal with in the book to metabolize these what under your pen come out to be crises of the air, certainly the pandemic, 9/11, climate change, the movement for Black lives. And so I think there's a lot that the book offers us in terms of political application, which I hope we'll come to. But that example about Trump and the balloon also reminded me of one of my favorite moments in the book, which was this really charming anecdote from Winnicott, from the psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott, who narrates a little girl who has oxygen explained to her, that we all have to breathe and make use of this resource, and she immediately wants more. And she immediately wonders if she can have more of this thing. And so as we get into, sort of these political questions, I thought maybe we could start with what comes kind of prior to that, which is this question of how we come into the dramas of breathing and of air. In your book, so much circulates around the question of birth and early childhood, where air and breathing become ways to stage these basic predicaments about self and other. Is it one of the drives? What is the kind of theory of freedom, reliance, dependence, and independence that's entailed by the question of breathing? And so I wonder if you could just start by narrating, like, what is the drama of breathing for the infant and the young child? And how does that kind of cue us up to these philosophic questions of, for example, dependence and independence?
Mm, thank you. Thank you so much, Nica. We got to meet before this and have a little chat about our mutual love of psychoanalysis. So it's so nice to have an interlocutor who cares about this strange thing called psychoanalysis. And it's funny that you mentioned Trump, who's full of a lot of hot air. And Mamdani, who just won the mayoral race here in New York, in his acceptance speech, he mentioned the first metaphor that he used was breathing. He said, we as New Yorkers, we can't afford where we live. We're all holding our breath. And I want this to be a new day. I want us to come in and breathe a new air. So it's kind of wild for me to in this moment hear this, sort of incredible air and breathing metaphor at this moment in which I think it's been the first sign of relief from the sort of Trump hot air. And at the very end of the book, I had a conclusion that was cut by my editor. And it was a phrase that I took from the psychoanalyst, from a psychoanalyst who was talking about that psychoanalysis wants to go back to an old idea of the commonwealth, and what we share in common and the difficulties that we have sharing and living together. And this is one of Freud's great points in Civilization and its discontents, which is how do we love our neighbor as ourselves? Why is this so unbelievably impossible? And the one thing that made me sad about cutting this conclusion was simply that I had transformed Freud's phrase that what psychoanalysis wants to do is transform hysterical misery into common human unhappiness. I wanted to change it to hysterical misery to the commonwealth
Mm.
of human unhappiness. And I think a lot of the book is about the kind of violence that came on the wake of facing a situation that was the first global pandemic in which we all looked at the air that we shared in common, our dependency on that air. And instead of understanding the idea that this is something that we have to do together, that this is about the fact that there are no divisions in an atmosphere, that we became much meaner as societies. And, the book I had written about COVID and breathing and air and asthma, because I had worked as a doing palliative care during the pandemic. But it took me a while to want to turn that work that I had done for the New York Review of Books into a book, which I only did obviously now, 5 years later. And I think it had to do with something of like seeing how this played out, to see that we had actually become so much meaner. And then to go back to a question of what is the relationship to air. And, between the pandemic and working as a palliative care psychologist, psychoanalyst at that point in time, and then coming to write this book, I had a daughter. And so I sort of start the book with the birth of my daughter and thinking about her relationship to breathing, to sucking, to eating, to cooing, to eventually beginning to talk, and how unbelievably important the relationship to air is. I mean, not just the first breath, which is obviously a big moment that everyone sort of waits for to make sure that the baby's like born and healthy and like has their first cry and has their first breath, but actually how powerful breathing is. Because if you think of the baby, like their head is in here or wherever bottle it could be, whatever the feeding device is, but they have to suck and breathe at the same time. And we know that like little children have endless colds because they're developing their immune system, and they navigate this impossibility. And you sort of ask a pediatrician, like, what's going on, like, in there? Like, this is so hard. And they said, well, like, think about how small their faces are, like the nose and the nostrils and the esophagus and the mouth and the air tubes. It's all really close together. And they're kind of amazing. There's like inborn capacity to navigate this and then, sort of out from it, produce sounds and then eventually produce language. Um, and so I wanted to touch on the pleasurable side of it. I wanted to touch on the like eros and life drive side of it. I wanted to touch on the sexual side of it. I wanted to talk about the uncanny strangeness of developing language, and then wonder how we got to a place where we destroyed our air. Just, kind of forgot, to use Luce Irigaray, the philosopher and psychoanalyst, that we forgot the air, that we forgot our dependency on air, that we just, sort of erased it and repressed it. So how do we go from something so central to something that not only do we forget it, but that we also destroy it? And to sort of really pull those questions into the foreground.
Yeah. I was really compelled by this idea of breathing as something that we have to first learn to do and then in a sense learn to forget, but also at moments learn to remember, and the cipher that it becomes for anxiety in terms of how we attend to our own embodied experience, our own language. And I think when I think about that baby who in a way is set up to learn to breathe but also faces all of these dramas, I mean that narrative really runs alongside, for example, your account of the COVID pandemic, which is, I think, lights up a slightly different history or genealogy, which is about like this question of, can you force someone to breathe? Can you make them breathe? Can you teach them to breathe? And of course, that shows up in the drama of the child, but also I think comes into real focus during your time as a pandemic doctor. And so maybe I'll just briefly narrate for the audience, and you can add on that you worked, in a ER ward during the height of the COVID pandemic, working with patients who were either to be intubated, currently intubated, who were in a kind of crisis. And I think one of the things that you really compellingly show is like the anxiety that it causes for those patients, but also for doctors, I think it's safe to say for you as well, to be put into contact with the non-obviousness of breath, the difficulty of controlling breath. And so I wanted to ask you to, if you would narrate a little bit like that folly and promise of breath control,
Yeah.
and sort of in relation to COVID, and also perhaps as it relates back to the child, because so much is put into play, the question of the body, but also of like aggression, helplessness. Um, yeah.
I mean, the thing that broke my heart was that like when everyone was trying to stockpile intubation machines and, like buy all the parts across the world and competing with each other to get, like the most intubation machines or whatever. Um, it turns out that they often didn't save patients' lives. And in fact, patients could breathe at quite lower level of oxygens. And pulmonologists were saying this for a lot of time. But there was a rush to put patients on intubators because we were just scared of their not being able to breathe. And we also didn't want to be in rooms with them while they were struggling to breathe because everyone was afraid of getting sick. And I'm not blaming doctors or, anything. There was a lot that we didn't know at the time. But there was something about the rush to just stick a person on a machine. And the history of the development of these machines is fascinating. And part of what was also fascinating was that this is what allowed us to save preemies, right? So they invented the respirator, and then they were able to finally make a small one for babies. And there's actually a long psychoanalytic story about us putting babies on these machines and keeping them breathing until their lungs could develop, but treating them not as subjects, like putting these preemies in boxes, like in the dark with no human contact on a machine because we just wanted to act like they weren't born. And we didn't realize that, yes, they were born prematurely, but they were still born. And it's really only until recently that we started doing the like skin to skin contact. But you even see in the protocols around that we treat the skin to skin as if it's like about developing certain chemicals in the baby, as opposed to treating them like a subject who's attached to a person and who's a living subject in relationship to other subjects. So there was something about like air, machines, subjects, and just our constant failure to recognize this. There's also a very strange fact, which is that the whatever, like scientific technological background at the development of respirators comes from airline technology. So it's basically war machinery, so what they developed was so that we could fly, planes at heights with, in atmospheres with not enough oxygen. And it's always the case that a lot of our technology is based on war, but you can see this kind of move between a technology that's used to kill and then the development of the technology which refuses to recognize life. And a lot of the story then of the atmosphere, the question of the destruction of our atmosphere, or even a global pandemic, has to do with the fact that we have basically conquered the air via airplanes.
Mm.
Um, and a lot of the questions of the destruction of the air, like Sloterdijk, who I know is a complicated figure, but nevertheless kind of talks about terror from the air as the beginning of a real change in which air becomes an object for technological control, as opposed to a background interdependency in which we live and that we rely on. And, to a certain extent could feel privileged insofar as we could ignore it, but nevertheless, we can't ignore it any longer. But we only come to realize that we're in trouble because we've made it an object of control and thereby destroyed it.
Mm.
It's this like, it's this sort of like very, very devastating picture, but one that really only came to me to be put together because of this experience in the wards. And asking, like, why did we rush to these machines? What is so hard about watching these people struggle to breathe? And, what does it really mean to share breath with another person or share the difficulty with breath? And I had asthma as a child, and so did my firstborn child, my son. He had asthma. So this led me down like a long path on reflecting on asthma. And many psychoanalysts have written about asthma, but nobody put this together into any comprehensive theory of a psychoanalysis of breathing, which kind of blew my mind. Like once I really started getting to it, I was like, how is breathing everywhere? And yet no one included it in the drives, included it really in a theory of anxiety, except as an addendum, or included it as a part of sexuality, which it also is, by the way.
Yeah.
And some of this also goes along with the kind of Eastern practice breathing techniques and breathing therapies that are very in vogue right now, which I'm very supportive of. I think that psychoanalysis and breathwork can go hand in hand, but I also really question it as a commodity that's being sold at this point in time when we can barely take cognizance of climate change and so on and so forth.
Mm. Yeah, there's so much to respond to in that. But I mean, I feel compelled to say I also was a child with asthma, and those parts of the book really stood out to me in terms of this kind of yeah, becoming conscious of yourself also in terms of what does it mean to ask for help in that situation? Do you want someone there? Do you not want someone there? And I was thinking about your story about why, basic questions about why it's so hard to be close to someone who is suffering at the level of this thing, which is supposed to remain unconscious but has become conscious. And I thought that your account of the displacement of those questions into technology, its relation to histories of war and control, was really compelling. Not to make of that a conspiracy, although conspiracy does come from an etymology of air, um, but to really, I think, pose the question of um, otherness and togetherness in a different way. For example, I'm thinking now of, is it Vanier, the nurse that you, or the doctor that you write about, who had the idea that you could take babies that were failing to thrive and kind of speak to them about their birth and their experiences and kind of bring them into life. And on the one hand, there's something fantastical about that. On the other hand, there's this incredible research where babies who have trouble coming off of ventilators and breathing support, sometimes just the noise of the machine, you write, is enough to remind them to keep going with their own breathing. And so I don't know, that makes me think about also your presence in the COVID ward and what is sufficient? Is it a need for a technological intervention that makes the lungs work, or is it about a certain kind of presence of the other? What is it that cues us up in our unconscious lives to be able to continue that kind of um, yeah, this thing that we can't, that we have to do. And what does it mean to try to bring genealogies of like force and demand to that for obviously very good reasons because you want people to stay alive. But
Yeah, the Vanier is so nice. She's like the baby psychoanalyst in Paris. I always joke that only in Paris will they have a baby psychoanalyst, which I love. I mean, just because like psychoanalysis is so strong there, and especially in hospitals still, unlike everywhere else. And so she's in the NICU ward, and she saw that these babies could still, so what would happen was they'd turn the machine off and the baby wouldn't keep breathing. And then they'd have to put them back on the machine. And one baby kept breathing when the machine was still on just because of the noise. So the question became, what weans the child from the noise of the machine into life? And so she had the mother who was pretending like, she was so scared that the baby was going to die that she, just kind of was hanging around in the background. She said, you need to talk to the baby. And so there's a transfer onto this rhythm of the machine that's much too constant into the life rhythms, that we have to live with. And I think that there's a lot about breathing, like we think of it as this, we want to think of it as machinic, as if it has this steady rhythm, but it doesn't. I mean, sometimes we're not breathing for half the day, or sometimes we're breathing really rapidly because we're nervous, or we have certain kinds of breathings when we're exercising. And I think that, like, the way that psychoanalysis thinks of drives as unnatural, that there's something funny about human beings, that we have a drive that's not disposed to natural rhythms in the way that we might imagine an animal is, that breathing's the same. Like, our breathing is not natural. And so it's capable of all kinds of strange symptomatic things. It's capable of wonderful things. Like, we can deep dive, and the longest breath holding after breathing oxygen is something like 36 minutes, which is mind boggling that someone can hold their breath for that long and go that deep. So the breath is capable of incredible things, and it's part of a denaturalization slash process of evolution in a human subject. And Freud and his favorite student Ferenczi got super weird about this. Ferenczi speculated that we all wanted to go back to the sea, which is, like the wish to return to the womb, because having to breathe on land was part of the catastrophe of the drying up of the seas. So that the kind of air breathing that we do is laced already with environmental catastrophe. as if we're just returning at this point in time, because when he was writing, this wasn't going on, or they didn't know about it at least. Now, with having destroyed the air and potentially with climate change, we're just returning to where we were. And actually where we always wanted to go because we never wanted to leave the seas. So, I mean, there's like these kind of like wild background stories in psychoanalysis that really focus on questions of environment and breath in the body, that were really important to me. And the other thing I think in terms of like force and togetherness is that we cannot separate breathing from speaking. And if there's one place in which I really diverge from Eastern philosophies on the question of breath, it's the way in which language is in a huge part of what they're interested in terms of breathing. But I'm very interested in speaking and in language and linguistics. And I don't know, the way this whole apparatus is part of this thing that we do, like we're doing right now together.
Totally. I mean, I was gonna go in that direction, and so I'll just like um, briefly double back around it, which is to say that I mean, along with these ideas about the control of breath, a lot of the book is dealing with like fantasies of liberated breath as fantasies for other like ciphers or ways of staging other ideas about liberation and freedom and the fantasies that attend to them in this kind of psychoanalytic way. And so breath is also understood in relation like to unleashed sexuality. You talk about Reich's like organon. But and it has this kind of like yeah this dream of universality of openness, and I mean you've already anticipated the move, but I'll just say that I was curious to hear more. We can speak a little more about the relation between these fantasies which do get associated with like rightly or wrongly with like yogic practices and breath work and anxieties about mouth breathing and so on, and then the turn to language, from like the fantasy of the free breath to like the injunction to say anything, which is a kind of freedom of breath, but of a very different and often quite anxiety ridden and even brutal kind, depending on the particular person. So I don't know if you want to say anything else about like sort of the fantasy of the liberation of breath and yoga, or we can just, turn straight to the question of language. But
No, I really love the way you link those two because it's very important to me. I mean, one that like my breath, my life, my death. I mean, I think that some of the philosophers who took up the theory of breath were really against this kind of individualistic version of um I don't know, considering these existential questions in an individualistic way. And you see the translation of that into the breathing practices is like what I can do with my breath, or the way that I'm going to liberate my breath. And this like was probably, I mean, the Reichians are going to be really upset with me, but I mean, Reich, I mean, he wanted the breathing to also be a political project. He thought like, you needed like good sex, liberatory breath, and that this would all lead to the end of fascism. But
mhm.
of course, there's something incredibly selfish in his psychology, because it's a psychology of personal liberation. And in fact, when Marcuse, looked at some of this that was going on, he said that this administration of happiness is nauseating to me. So like I feel bad beating up Reich because
I don't think there are many Reichians on this call. I mean, if there are, you should feel free to show yourself in the Q&A and we can talk about it more, but there's not that many of them about.
Yeah, and like it turned into a cult. It went the way of cults that went a lot of the way of cults. But I still think that we see some of that today in the way in which wellness, is like an industry that's sold for the alleviation of alienation,
Mhm.
21st century alienation that doesn't deal with any of the communal problems that we have. So I really appreciate that you bring that up because I wanted to think about language. I mean, it's very important in psychoanalysis, not just the freedom to speak in analysis, which is, of course, incredibly important that you say to the patient, say anything, say everything, including, what feels untoward or what feels socially unacceptable. But with the idea that this kind of working on the everything that you have to say will hopefully make you a better citizen, help you figure out the way in which you need to enter into civilization and deal with What's so unpleasant there? I mean, Lacan said something like, when Freud looked at the world, he said it's an awful lot of aggravation for a result that's not very satisfying. It's a very optimistic view of life. But Freud wanted us to find a relationship to our happiness, unhappiness, pleasure, unpleasure, so that we could find a way to contribute and live together. Find a way to contribute something to the world and figure out how to live together because it's very, very hard. And I really appreciate this. And I think that we're in a time in which we can barely say anything to each other. We're very scared of speaking to each other. We do it all under the cover of anonymity online. I'm always surprised that I'm afraid to pick up my phone now, as if I don't want to hear another person's voice. And I might have picked this up from my Gen Z son, but I mean, we're having a very hard time speaking to one another
Mhm.
in this sort of age of political polarization, as if we can't bear to hear an opinion that's different from ours. And so, the end of the book was, I called it the language lessons, but something about what breathing needs to teach us about how difficult it is to live with language
Mhm.
and speak to one another.
Yeah. I wonder if building off of that, would you like to say something about how you opened on to questions of race in the book? Because we've said a lot about more skeptically around fantasies of liberation associated with certain kinds of breath, but then of course you have this beautiful engagement with like um, Black breathing practices that are related to breath and sort of different ways that the moniker "I can't breathe" was mobilized politically. Um, not in contrast to what you were saying before, but just as like a further elaboration. And I also couldn't help but think about, what the relation between those dimensions of discussing and politicizing racism and like the material breathing effects. I can't breathe, but also that Black children are something like 8 times more likely to have asthma, speaking of asthma, and the racialization of like questions of pollution. And so, how did you come to write about the kind of racial dimensions of this topic, and what does it kind of like add to our understanding here?
Yeah, I mean, it was wild to me because there was a moment at which, when I was working in the hospital and they like tied a woman to the bed because she kept pulling out like she wasn't intubated yet. She had like the oxygen tubes in her nose and she was having a really hard time. I mean, I think she was becoming sort of destabilized and they just wanted to tie her to her bed because they didn't want someone to sit in the room with her where none of the staff wanted to do that. Like you really went in and out of the patient rooms. And I tried to talk to them because there was a lot of psychosis on the ward, which actually it came out later that there was either psychosis in relationship to intensive care kind of treatment or maybe as a COVID symptom. And I was like, what are we going to do about all this psychosis? And like the hospital didn't want to address the issue. And then I was like, I can't, like I'm part of something right now that I don't feel good being part of. And I was just a volunteer. So and this was like right as Black Lives Matter took off in New York on the streets. And so it was really strange to go from the situation of this direness and also knowing that COVID did not affect us equally, that it affected Black and brown bodies far more than it did white people. And then the "I can't breathe" um, as the slogan for the Black Lives Matter movement took off. So it was very, very surreal. Um, and when you look at the statistics across the globe in terms of childhood asthma, and in terms of where there's poor health, which is obviously more in cities and urban centers, we are disproportionately affected. So while we have this global situation of interdependency, we know that the statistics are stacked against minorities. And there's something about the vulnerability of breath that it seems to be one of the places that's attacked in hate crimes, especially in racial violence by the police, as if, like they go right there to this life force, to this vulnerability. And I like Akili Mbembe's, universal right to breathe. His call for that really moves me. At the same time, when I look at this panorama of inequality, you say, how do we hold up a universal like that? You know,
Yeah.
like, how is that gonna take place? And it's not to be pessimistic, but to put the conundrum really in the foreground.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're still in such a deferred, maybe just now, state of processing, I think, of our hopes for the pandemic in a certain way, although it seems strange to say, and those realities. I mean, I think the idea that it was somehow equalizing, that it cut through questions of class in certain ways because there was a kind of shared new vulnerability. Of course, there's some truth to that. And also, even then, as you're indicating, it wasn't true. It had hugely racially and class-based disproportionate impacts. And also, what it's produced has played out many of these forms of inequality. And so I think um, to really gain like a critical understanding um, of the dynamics of that. And I also want to say that of course, I share with you the sense that this is not about blaming doctors, but I found it incredibly useful and bracing for myself personally, in any case, and I would say this to the audience, to read an account of the decisions that were made about how to intubate, treatment on the ward, the discomfort that was posed being in the presence of this new kind of illness, the role of psychosis. Um, and I think of like the work of Frantz Fanon, who for whom the question of psychosis was always posing the question of the social. Like, is it a refusal of language because someone is psychotic, or is it a refusal of language because they don't feel included in the symbolic circulation of a certain society? And I think finding ways to come into contact with the organization of like the life forces and also of aggression, which was so hidden from view in like the valorization of healthcare workers, in just like the noise of the pandemic. I think starting to process that is hugely important and like fruitful. And I also, I mean, we can speak more about that, but I had a kind of question about writing because I also have the sense that there is a deferral. It's taken us a while to start writing pandemic books. It seems like it took you some years to kind of pick up this topic in this way. And I think I'm curious about that, and I think I'm curious in a more general sense about the writing process of the book and what it has to do with breathing. I mean, I'll also just say that like having read the book a few times now, this third time, as I was thinking about this question of lag and deferral, which you write about in the book, I really had this sense, like very strongly, that the book was kind of breathing in its rhythm, the rhythm of the writing, in the sense that, for example, often the chapters end with a kind of a beautiful claim, like something a bit more assertive, conclusive. And then I see you take those same ideas and like recirculate them and aerate them in the next chapter and let them have a kind of ongoing life. Like there's a certain kind of play of like lag and circulation in the writing. And it really made me wonder, like, um, if you think that the topic of breathing in the way that you came back around to it after some years did something for you in the writing process, or like how those interfaced.
It's a good question. I mean, in part, I wanna I wanna give my editor credit. He was such a good
Uh-huh.
editor. He was like he was like, "I really like you, when you compress information." And it's true, like, I can kind of, like, take a density and I can, like, I can, like, squeeze it or I think it's, like, something that you maybe I do as an analyst with patients, but, and so he wouldn't let me go on and on too much. And he cut a lot, but it made these, like, compressed chapters, like, he made me move, he made me, like, really move through material, but like, if I look at older work, like my book on the body, the one that was, like, more generally on the body, it's, like, really staccato. It's, like, and I wanted in that book to play with, like, really crazy staccato rhythms. Like, sometimes I would just read, like, one Freud paper for, like, 50 pages, and then I would just, like, kind of rush through something, and I wanted, like, all the crazy rhythms of the body, so I'm glad that this one is, like, more of a smooth ride, and I think that does have something to do with the possibilities of breathing. I mean, I appreciate all the crazy things you can do with breathing, like there's these Wim Hof people who try to exhale until they pass out and stuff. But I think
I
the
didn't find it totally smooth. I just found it breath-like in your sense. I mean, it was smooth and beautiful, and also that's what I mean. I mean, there's these interesting, yeah, sorry to interrupt.
well, no, there's the central portion of the book I call the doom scroll. I get a little doomsday in the middle. There's that portion. Um, but I mean, there was also something. I mean, I'm glad that I'm glad that you actually think that it's not completely smooth because I did get really frustrated when I was reading a lot of books about air and breathing in atmospheres because they got too unfortunately airy. I mean, no, I mean like really, and I was just like, and like everything got a bit precious. And there's something, I mean, especially as a psychoanalyst, there's something uncanny about breathing, or there's something strange about it. And I really wanted to bring that back to it. And like you can get into this place in which like breathing is everything and air is everything and atmosphere is, everything and envelops you. And I love all of that, but I needed like an uncanny edge to the experience of writing about it. And politics has a lot to do with that, actually, the politics of breathing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, and putting a pin in, like, the also why the thing that is comfortable and enveloping has its own dangers in various ways, and to keep that kind of dynamic. Um, I mean, I have many more questions, but I wonder if we should turn to the Q&A because there have been a few questions put in, and I think we're about at that time, because we run until 3. Is that okay, Jameson? Okay. So, what I'm gonna do is just read anything that gets sent through the Q&A, and so if you do have questions you've been building up, then please send them because 'cause I'll keep an eye on it. Um, okay, so I'm seeing these for the first time too, but, Fred L says, "Why do we lack awareness of the impact of breath on sleep? My adult onset asthma attacks were the first time I recognized that when we can't breathe freely, we don't sleep, period, a condition which is acutely intolerable."
Yeah, there's, I mean, we lack information on the impact of breathing on all of our systems, in a way, our bodily systems, including the fact that a lot of us are mouth breathers in sleep, which is a big topic on the internet these days. And breathing through the nose while you sleep is very important because it's part of the cleansing and the immune system process. Basically, you breathe through your nose, you clean your breath, you breathe through your mouth, and you create bacteria. But there's all kinds of knowledge going back to ancient Egypt around breath and health. And for some reason, and this was like, James Nestor wrote this like New York Times bestseller, and I used it a lot from a psychoanalytic point of view because a lot of what he does in that book is he's like, how is it that this knowledge never makes it into the medical canon?
Mm,
And there's something really interesting as if it's just forgotten over and over and over again. And like there was the guy who the Olympics, when the Black Panthers put their fists up, they were trained by a guy who cured emphysema amongst Vietnam vets and got them all up walking through his choral exercises. And it's still not part of the canon of the treatment of emphysema. So
mm,
there's so much around this that has to do with the repression of breathing. And this is why I really, my like megalomaniac claim in the book is that I'm adding breathing to Freud's and Lacan's repression. So Freud said we repress sexuality, Lacan said we repress language, and I'm adding breathing to that we repress breathing and all of the attendant knowledge that we could have in relationship to it.
yeah, I thought that was really persuasive, and I think there's also something about the way it lights up a discourse where there is this amazing history of science that needs to be threaded through the philosophic questions with which it's engaged, where there's something about having something that's atmospheric that then gets consolidated into an object and becomes possible to study, but also loses some of the stakes. I'm writing a book about exhaustion, which has a similar kind of, I think, I won't claim amnesia, but definitely repression. But then we have other questions here. So, okay, Susan Brown says, Susan, you said you think this might be too triggering to discuss, so it's fine if we skip it, but I think we should move towards it. I mean, you said in addition to breath of people of color being in jeopardy, there's something true for women with choking, for example, of women increasingly becoming a normal sexual activity, the murder of women by strangulation, and the more everyday experience of being silenced in home and work environments. And so I think you're inviting us to think about the connection between those ways of controlling breath. So that's from Susan Brown.
Thank you, Susan. It's a big part of the book. So, actually, so thank you for asking that. I mean, one, with all the obsession with whether birth was traumatic for children, and whether it was better for them to be born by cesarean or born vaginally, I said, how is it that all these people never asked once about the mothers who were giving birth? And then I went back to a lot of the origins of questions of democracy in ancient Greece, of which women obviously weren't a part of, and how their speech was banned, their bodies were banned, especially around birth and menstruation, and how their signs of grief were banned. So it had a lot to do with the emotional signs of women around the body and breath and speech, that democracy, at least at that point in time, was contingent on the absolute silencing of women's sounds. And also to point out that during the pandemic, a second shadow pandemic was women who were victims of domestic violence because they were locked up at home with their partners who were afraid of dying. And when men are afraid of dying, they often take it out on women who become the signifiers for them of death. So there's a lot about, obviously, the unequal effects of the pollution of the air on racial and class, race and class-based, but also on women. And actually, suicide rates amongst women and children have been going up and up and up and up,
Mm.
usually through asphyxiation, along with,
I'm glad that we got to some of those questions because it was on my list of questions too, and I think it's both crucial, of course, in itself, and also a really important part of the book. Um, okay, Karen Bester says, um, "We must smell because we must breathe. I'm interested to know if smell features in your discussion of breathing, and if it does, any further insight you can share in their connection." I'm smiling because there's definitely a question of the nose in psychoanalysis that this is immediately raising, but I'll let Jameson answer.
No, there's a lot about the nose, and Freud's mentor slash quasi analyst was obsessed with the nose, and he thought that men had a similarity to like menstrual cycles in their nose, and he got Freud to write down every time his nose filled up with mucus, and he was trying to time it with his bouts of depression. It's a totally crazy story, but there's a whole nose, and one of the earliest patients of Freud, a woman named Emma Eckstein, Freud allowed this guy to do surgery on her nose to cure her hysteria, and he basically almost killed her by malpractice. So there's like a serious story of malpractice against a female patient at the origin of psychoanalysis on her nose. Um, and it's important also for Freud that we as human beings learn to stand upright and we stop smelling one another, and then we defunctionalized our noses. So, like something like 75% of our nasal sensory cells like don't work compared to animals. And Freud thought that this was catastrophic but slash part of the development of the human subject, and especially the hyper reliance on the visual and the kind of like immediate knowledge that you might have through the nose we don't have anymore. So you have this picture of this confused, neurotic person who has to rely on looking. And I think Lacan makes a joke somewhere that a dog never confuses his owner for someone else, and so therefore doesn't have transference, and so couldn't be analyzed.
That's really funny. I've never heard that. That's awesome. I mean, I think there is also this question of like, the technological and social development of like breathing and the sense of smell as a capacity that can change, which really came out in our fear of masking and our sort of sense that there must be a kind of, as you said, like a natural breath to go back to. And I think these questions about these sensory intersections really also point to just like fear of historical change, questions of historicity, and yeah, then also, of course, um, techniques of help. Okay, Joe. Um, Joe, you had a couple of questions. I'm going to go for this middle one, which asks, is repressing breathing a form of body armoring? Can traumatic incidents be stored in repressed breathing patterns? And so this is also, I think, a question about just like the general intuition about breath and trauma work, which you do discuss in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like a crazy yoga person, so at some point in the book, I try to deal with my relationship to yoga. But in general, there's obviously a big somatic question, and it was a question amongst Freud and his followers. Like, do you through language try to get close to what's repressed, or can you like do it through the body and try to touch what's repressed that way. And, of course, Freud, as you can imagine, always wants to go by way of like consciousness and language because he gave up hypnosis, right? And he gave up the kind of power that someone has, or the power that the doctor has to work on the level of the body. So a lot of his disagreements with the somatic practitioners are that you're giving someone way too much power and you're trying to get the patient to be able to do this on their own. I don't know. I mean, that's like the historical argument. I think a lot is held in the body. I think the body is incredibly important. I think psychoanalysis can evoke the body and get very close to it. But I also think that being in analysis lets you do other stuff and maybe lets it work more easily for you because it opens up different channels. And so I'm like a equal opportunity practitioner. I mean, I believe in analysis, but analysis has always also let me do yoga and other sort of body therapies that have helped me. So I don't prescribe things to patients, but I'm always really interested in what they run around and do. So,
Yeah. I was just teaching Anna O to first years, and it was really Anna O, which is one of Freud's case studies, and it was really striking to me their frustration with him that he didn't simply read her pain off her body, that there was so much she was communicating without saying it. Actually, well, in this case, to Breuer, who was the doctor practicing, and they felt a kind of, I think, partly because of their immersion in these questions around the body and trauma in this moment, we're like, well, why couldn't he say what was obvious? And then the question becomes, what is the virtue of holding out for it coming into language in a particular way in relation to that kind of listening? And so I thought that was an interesting, like, um, atmosphere around that question. Um, okay, Javi Carell says, can you say something about breathlessness? I offer the distinction between normal and pathological breathlessness. Normal takes place within the everyday. Pathological breathlessness threatens and disrupts it.
mm. I mean, a lot of the work on asthma in the history of the psychoanalytic literature in terms of that kind of breathlessness really interested me, and Winnicott was, I think, one of the most important. Nika gave a really nice example about the little girl who wanted more and more and more oxygen. And he says, it's interesting how we could get an idea of a lack in relationship to this. And that's an imaginary lack as opposed to the real lack of breathlessness that can happen with an asthmatic child. In his study of asthmatic children, he says something really beautiful. And I really hadn't understood this, even though I had asthma and my son had asthma, is that asthma is a failure to exhale, which we often don't think as you see the asthmatic person like but like they can't let the breath go. And Winnicott was a pediatrician, and in addition to being a psychoanalyst, so he said it has to be an inhibition in relationship to some internal fear that we can't see, because he saw a kind of spontaneous trigger of asthma in very, very young babies, like 8, 9 months old, when they were put in a situation to do something pleasurable that they couldn't allow themselves to do. So he thought, what is it that they fear in reaching towards a pleasure that we can't see? It has to be some already internalized feeling of persecution. So I would really like extend that outwards and say that the pathological breathlessness is about a feeling of persecution, and we're taking in persecution all the time. So I'm surprised that any of us breathe sometimes, like, when I really think about it and I look at this book.
In a way, that's a fitting place to close.